Well, headlight technology has gotten quite a bit of an upgrade in recent years.
Yeah, Diana asked, is there a law on how bright vehicle headlights can be? Here's Victor Puente with the answer to that good question.
There are both federal regulations and state laws when it comes to how bright headlights can be. On the federal level, the max for headlights is 3,000 candelas, although some people say lumens. Candelas measure the intensity of a light, whereas lumens measure the total output. Both seem to be used interchangeably when it comes to headlights. A state law uses a different system. It says maximum brightness should, quote, reveal persons and vehicles at a distance of at least 350 feet ahead for all conditions of loading. But it also says the driver shall use a distribution of light or composite beam so aimed that the glaring rays are not projected into the eyes of the oncoming driver. So the direction seems to be just as important as the distance. Now, while brightness may be a factor, there are a few other issues that have to do with LED lights. First, LEDs produce a much whiter light with a blue tint as compared to the yellow light of a halogen bulb. That light is harsher to our eyes. Also, when LED bulbs are installed as an aftermarket add-on, if they aren't properly aligned, they can send that light up at an angle straight into the eyes of other drivers. And if they're put into a housing meant for a halogen bulb, that can also create issues for other drivers. New vehicles that come with LED lights, those are fine. Switching out an entire housing for LED lights also seems okay as long as they're properly aligned. But the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says LEDs are not currently permitted in a replaceable bulb headlamp. In 2020, then Representative Regina Huff filed a bill that would have explicitly made it illegal to replace halogen bulbs with LEDs. That bill did not make it out of the Transportation Committee. If you have a good question, email us. Goodquestion@WKYT.com. I'll see you on WKYT Mornings.